Don Juan, Canto 2. O ye who teach the ingenuous youth of nations, Holland, France, England, Germany, or Spain, I pray ye flog them upon all occasions. It mends their morals, never mind the pain. The best of mothers and of educations in Juan's case were but employed in vain, since in a way that's rather of the oddest he became divested of his native modesty. Had he but been placed at a public school, in the third form, or even in the fourth, his daily task had kept his fancy cool. At least had he been nurtured in the north. Spain may prove an exception to the rule, but then exceptions always prove its worth. A lad of 16 causing a divorce puzzled his tutors very much, of course. I can't say that it puzzles me at all, if all things be considered. First there was his lady mother mathematical, never mind. His tutor, an old ass. A pretty woman, that's quite natural, or else the thing had hardly come to pass. A husband rather old, not much in unity with his young wife. A time and opportunity. Well, well, the world must turn upon its axis, and all mankind turn with it, heads or tails, and live and die, make love and pay our taxes, and as the veering wind shifts, shift our sails. The king commands us, and the doctor quacks us, the priest instructs, and so our life exhales. A little breath, love, wine, ambition, fame, fighting, devotion, dust, perhaps a name. I said that Juan had been sent to Cadiz, a pretty town, I recollect it well. 'Tis there the mart of the colonial trade is, or was, before Peru learned to rebel, and such sweet girls, I mean such graceful ladies, their very walk would make your bosom swell. I can't describe it, though so much it strike, nor liken it, I never saw the like. An Arab horse, a stately stag, a barb new broke, a camel-leopard, a gazelle. No, none of these will do. And then their garb, their veil and petticoat, alas, to dwell upon such things would very near absorb a canto. Then their feet and ankles, well, thank heaven I've got no metaphor quite ready. And so, my sober muse, come, let's be steady. Chaste muse, well, if you must, you must. The veil thrown back a moment with the glancing hand, while the o'erpowering eye that turns you pale flashes into the heart. All sunny land of love, when I forget you, may I fail to say my prayers. But never was there planned address through which the eyes give such a volley, excepting the Venetian Fazioli. But to our tale. The Donna Inez sent her son to Cadiz only to embark. To stay there had not answered her intent. But why? We leave the reader in the dark. 'Twas for a voyage that the young man was meant, as if a Spanish ship were Noah's ark, to wean him from the wickedness of earth, and send him like a dove of promise forth. Don Juan bade his valet pack his things according to direction, then received a lecture and some money. For 4 springs he was to travel, and though Inez grieved, as every kind of parting has its stings, she hoped he would improve, perhaps believed. A letter too she gave, he never read it, of good advice, and 2 or 3 of credit. In the meantime, to pass her hours away, brave Inez now set up a Sunday school for naughty children who would rather play, like truant rogues, the devil or the fool. Infants of 3 years old were taught that day. Dunces were whipped or set upon a stool, their manners mending and their morals curing. She taught them to suppress their vice and urine. Juan embarked. The ship got under way. The wind was fair, the water passing rough. A devil of a sea rolls in that bay, as I, who've crossed it oft, know well enough. And standing upon deck, the dashing spray flies in one's face and makes it weather tough. And there he stood to take, and take again, his first, perhaps his last, Farewell of Spain. I can't but say it is an awkward sight to see one's native land receding through the growing waters. It unmans one quite, especially when life is rather new. I recollect Great Britain's coast looks white, but almost every other country is blue. When gazing on them, mystified by distance, we enter on our nautical existence. So Juan stood bewildered on the deck. The wind sung, cordage strained, and sailors swore, and the ship creaked. The town became a speck, from which away so fair and fast they bore. The best of remedies is a beef steak against seasickness. Try it, sir, before you sneer, and I assure you this is true, for I have found it answer. So may you. Don Juan stood, and gazing from the stern, beheld his native Spain receding far. First partings form a lesson hard to learn. Even nations feel this when they go to war. There is a sort of unexpressed concern, a kind of shock that sets one's heart ajar. At leaving even the most unpleasant people and places, one keeps looking at the steeple. But Juan had got many things to leave. His mother, and a mistress, and no wife, so that he had much better cause to grieve than many persons more advanced in life. And if we now and then a sigh must heave at quitting even those we quit in strife, no doubt we weep for those the heart endears, that is, till deeper griefs congeal our tears. So Juan wept, as wept the captive Jews by Babel's waters, still remembering Zion. I'd weep, but mine is not a weeping muse, and such light griefs are not a thing to die on. Young men should travel, if but to amuse themselves, and the next time their servants tie on behind their carriages their new portmanteau, perhaps it may be lined with this my canto. And Juan wept, and much he sighed and thought, while his salt tears dropped into the salt sea. Sweets to the sweet, I like so much to quote. You must excuse this extract. 'Tis where she, the Queen of Denmark, for Ophelia brought flowers to the grave. And sobbing often, he reflected on his present situation, and seriously resolved on reformation. Farewell, my Spain, a long farewell, he cried. Perhaps I may revisit thee no more, but die, as many an exiled heart hath died, of its own thirst to see again thy shore. Farewell, where Guadalquivir's waters glide. Farewell, my mother, and since all is o'er, farewell too, dearest Julia. Here he drew her letter out again, and read it through. And oh, if e'er I should forget, I swear, but that's impossible and cannot be. Sooner shall this blue ocean melt to air, sooner shall earth resolve itself to sea, than I resign thine image, O my fair, or think of anything excepting thee, a mind diseased no remedy can physic. Here the ship gave a lurch, and he grew seasick. Sooner shall heaven kiss earth. Here he fell sicker. Oh, Julia, what is every other woe? For God's sake, let me have a glass of liquor. Pedro, Batista, help me down below. Julia, my love, you rascal Pedro, quicker. Oh, Julia, this cursed vessel pitches so. Beloved Julia, hear me still beseeching. Here he grew inarticulate with reaching. He felt that chilling heaviness of heart, or rather stomach, which alas attends, beyond the best apothecary's art, the loss of love, the treachery of friends, or death of those we dote on, when a part of us dies with them as each fond hope ends. No doubt he would have been much more pathetic, but the sea acted as a strong emetic. Love's a capricious power. I've known it hold out through a fever caused by its own heat, but be much puzzled by a cough and cold, and find a quinsy very hard to treat. Against all noble maladies he's bold, but vulgar illnesses don't like to meet, nor that a sneeze should interrupt his sigh, nor inflammations redden his blind eye. But worst of all is nausea, or a pain about the lower region of the bowels. Love, who heroically breathes a vein, shrinks from the application of hot towels. And purgatives are dangerous to his reign, sea-sickness, death. His love was perfect. How else could Juan's passion, while the billows roar, resist his stomach, ne'er at sea before? The ship, called the Most Holy Trinidada, was steering duly for the port Leghorn, for there the Spanish family Moncada were settled long ere Juan's sire was born. They were relations, and for them he had a letter of introduction, which the morn of his departure had been sent him by his Spanish friends for those in Italy. His suite consisted of 3 servants and a tutor, the licentiate Pedrillo, who several languages did understand, but now lay sick and speechless on his pillow, and rocking in his hammock longed for land, his headache being increased by every billow, and the waves oozing through the porthole made his berth a little damp, and him afraid. 'Twas not without some reason, for the wind increased at night until it blew a gale, and though 'twas not much to a naval mind, some landsmen would have looked a little pale, for sailors are in fact a different kind. At sunset they began to take in sail, for the sky showed it would come on to blow, and carry away perhaps a mast or so. At 1 o'clock the wind with sudden shift threw the ship right into the trough of the sea, which struck her aft and made an awkward rift, started the stern post, also shattered the whole of her stern frame, and ere she could lift herself from out her present jeopardy, the rudder tore away. 'Twas time to sound the pumps, and there were 4 feet water found. One gang of people instantly was put upon the pumps, and the remainder set to get up part of the cargo and what not, but they could not come at the leak as yet. At last they did get at it really, but still their salvation was an even bet. The water rushed through in a way quite puzzling, while they thrust sheets, shirts, jackets, bales of muslin into the opening. But all such ingredients would have been vain, and they must have gone down, despite of all their efforts and expedients, but for the pumps. I'm glad to make them known to all the brother tars who may have need hence, for 50 tons of water were upthrown by them per hour, and they had all been undone, but for their maker, Mr. Man of London. As day advanced, the weather seemed to abate, and then the leak they reckoned to reduce, and keep the ship afloat, though 3 feet yet kept 2 hand and 1 chain pump still in use. The wind blew fresh again. As it grew late, a squall came on, and while some guns broke loose, a gust, which all descriptive power transcends, laid with 1 blast the ship on her beam ends. There she lay, motionless, and seemed upset. The water left the hold and washed the decks, and made a scene men do not soon forget, for they remember battles, fires, and wrecks, or any other thing that brings regret, or breaks their hopes, or hearts, or heads, or necks. Thus drownings are much talked of by the divers and swimmers who may chance to be survivors. Immediately the masts were cut away, both main and mizzen. First the mizzen went, the mainmast followed, but the ship still lay like a mere log and baffled our intent. Foremast and bowsprit were cut down, and they eased her at last, although we never meant to part with all till every hope was blighted, and then with violence the old ship righted. It may be easily supposed, while this was going on, some people were unquiet, that passengers would find it much amiss to lose their lives as well as spoil their diet, that even the able seaman, deeming his days nearly o'er, might be disposed to riot, as upon such occasions tars will ask for grog, and sometimes drink rum from the cask. There's naught, no doubt, so much the spirit calms as rum and true religion. Thus it was some plundered, some drank spirits, some sung psalms. The high wind made the treble, and as bass the hoarse, harsh waves kept time. Fright cured the qualms of all the luckless landsmen's seasick moors. Strange sounds of wailing, blasphemy, devotion clamoured in chorus to the roaring ocean. Perhaps more mischief had been done, but for our Juan, who with sense beyond his years got to the spirit room, and stood before it with a pair of pistols, and their fears, as if death were more dreadful by his door of fire than water, spite of oath and tears, kept still aloof the crew, who ere they sunk thought it would be becoming to die drunk. "Give us more grog," they cried, "for it will be all 1 hour hence." Juan answered, "No, 'tis true that death awaits both you and me, but let us die like men, not sink below like brutes." And thus his dangerous post kept he, and none liked to anticipate the blow. And even Pedrillo, his most reverend tutor, was for some rum a disappointed suitor. The good old gentleman was quite aghast, and made a loud and pious lamentation, repented all his sins, and made a last irrevocable vow of reformation. Nothing should tempt him more, this peril past, to quit his academic occupation in cloisters of the classic Salamanca, to follow Juan's wake like Sancho Panza. But now there came a flash of hope once more. Day broke, and the wind lulled. The masts were gone, the leak increased, shoals round her, but no shore. The vessel swam, yet still she held her own. They tried the pumps again, and though before their desperate efforts seemed all useless grown, a glimpse of sunshine set some hands to bail. The stronger pumped, the weaker thrummed a sail. Under the vessel's keel the sail was passed, and for the moment it had some effect. But with a leak, and not a stick of mast, nor rag of canvas, what could they expect? But still 'tis best to struggle to the last. 'Tis never too late to be wholly wrecked. And though 'tis true that man can only die once, 'tis not so pleasant in the Gulf of Lions. There winds and waves had hurled them, and from thence without their will they carried them away, for they were forced with steering to dispense, and never had as yet a quiet day on which they might repose, or even commence a jury-mast or rudder, or could say the ship would swim an hour, which by good luck still swam, though not exactly like a duck. The wind, in fact, perhaps was rather less, but the ship laboured so, they scarce could hope to weather out much longer. The distress was also great with which they had to cope for want of water, and their solid mess was scant enough. In vain the telescope was used, nor sail nor shore appeared in sight, naught but the heavy sea and coming night. Again the weather threatened, again blew a gale, and in the fore and after hold water appeared. Yet though the people knew all this, the most were patient, and some bold, until the chains and leathers were worn through of all our pumps. A wreck complete she rolled, at mercy of the waves, whose mercies are like human beings during civil war. Then came the carpenter at last with tears in his rough eyes, and told the captain he could do no more. He was a man in years, and long had voyaged through many a stormy sea, and if he wept at length, they were not fears that made his eyelids as a woman's be, but he, poor fellow, had a wife and children, 2 things for dying people quite bewildering. The ship was evidently settling now, fast by the head, and all distinction gone. Some went to prayers again, and made a vow of candles to their saints, but there were none to pay them with, and some looked o'er the bow. Some hoisted out the boats, and there was one that begged Pedrillo for an absolution, who told him to be damned in his confusion. Some lashed them in their hammocks, some put on their best clothes as if going to a fair, some cursed the day on which they saw the sun, and gnashed their teeth, and howling tore their hair, And others went on as they had begun, getting the boats out, being well aware that a tight boat will live in a rough sea, unless with breakers close beneath her lee. The worst of all was that in their condition, having been several days in great distress, 'twas difficult to get out such provision as now might render their long suffering less. Men, even when dying, dislike inanition. Their stock was damaged by the weather's stress. 2 casks of biscuit and a keg of butter were all that could be thrown into the cutter. But in the longboat they contrived to stow some pounds of bread, though injured by the wet, water, a 20-gallon cask or so, 6 flasks of wine, and they contrived to get a portion of their beef up from below, and with a piece of pork moreover met, but scarce enough to serve them for a luncheon. Then there was rum, 8 gallons in a puncheon. The other boats, the yawl and pinnace, had been stove in the beginning of the gale, and the longboat's condition was but bad, as there were but 2 blankets for a sail, and 1 oar for a mast, which a young lad threw in by good luck over the ship's rail. And 2 boats could not hold, far less be stored, to save 1/2 the people then on board. 'Twas twilight, and the sunless day went down over the waste of waters, like a veil, which, if withdrawn, would but disclose the frown of one whose hate is masked but to assail. Thus to their hopeless eyes the night was shown, and grimly darkled o'er their faces pale, and the dim desolate deep. 12 days had fear been their familiar, and now death was here. Some trial had been making at a raft, with little hope in such a rolling sea, a sort of thing at which one would have laughed, if any laughter at such times could be, unless with people who too much have quaffed, and have a kind of wild and horrid glee, half epileptical and half hysterical. Their preservation would have been a miracle. At 8:30 booms, hencoops, spars, and all things, for a chance, had been cast loose that still could keep afloat the struggling tars. For yet they strove, although of no great use. There was no light in heaven but a few stars. The boats put off o'ercrowded with their crews. She gave a heel and then a lurch to port, and going down head foremost sunk in short. Then rose from sea to sky the wild farewell, then shrieked the timid, and stood still the brave. Then some leaped overboard with dreadful yell, as eager to anticipate their grave. And the sea yawned around her like a hell, and down she sucked with her the whirling wave, like one who grapples with his enemy and strives to strangle him before he die. And first one universal shriek there rushed, louder than the loud ocean, like a crash of echoing thunder, and then all was hushed, save the wild wind and the remorseless dash of billows, but at intervals there gushed, accompanied with a convulsive splash, a solitary shriek, the bubbling cry of some strong swimmer in his agony. The boats, as stated, had got off before, and in them crowded several of the crew, and yet their present hope was hardly more than what it had been, for so strong it blew there was slight chance of reaching any shore, and then they were too many, though so few. 9 in the cutter, 30 in the boat were counted in them when they got afloat. All the rest perished. Near 200 souls had left their bodies, and what's worse, alas, when over Catholics the ocean rolls, they must wait several weeks before a mass takes off 1 peck of purgatorial coals, because till people know what's come to pass, they won't lay out their money for the dead. It costs 3 francs for every mass that's said. Juan got into the longboat, and there contrived to help Pedrillo to a place. It seemed as if they had exchanged their care, for Juan wore the magisterial face which courage gives, while poor Pedrillo's pair of eyes were crying for their owner's case. Batista, though, a name called shortly Tita, was lost by getting at some aqua vita. Pedro, his valet, too, he tried to save, but the same cause, conducive to his loss, left him so drunk he jumped into the wave, as o'er the cutter's edge he tried to cross, and so he found a wine and watery grave. They could not rescue him, although so close, because the sea ran higher every minute, and for the boat the crew crept crowding in it. A small old spaniel, which had been Don Jose's, his father's, whom he loved, as ye may think, for on such things the memory reposes with tenderness, stood howling on the brink, knowing, dogs have such intellectual noses, no doubt the vessel was about to sink. And Juan caught him up, and ere he stepped off threw him in, then after him he leapt. He also stuffed his money where he could about his person, and Pedrillo's too, who let him do in fact whate'er he would, not knowing what himself to say or do, as every rising wave his dread renewed. But Juan, trusting they might still get through, and deeming there were remedies for any ill, thus re-embarked his tutor and his spaniel. 'Twas a rough night, and blew so stiffly yet that the sail was becalmed between the seas, though on the waves' high top too much to set, they dared not take it in for all the breeze. Each sea curled o'er the stern, and kept them wet, and made them bail without a moment's ease, so that themselves as well as hopes were damped, and the poor little cutter quickly swamped. 9 souls more went in her. The longboat still kept above water, with an oar for mast. 2 blankets stitched together, answering ill instead of sail, were to the oar made fast. Though every wave rolled, menacing to fill, and present peril all before surpassed, they grieved for those who perished with the cutter, and also for the biscuit casks and butter. The sun rose red and fiery, a sure sign of the continuance of the gale. To run before the sea until it should grow fine was all that for the present could be done. A few teaspoonfuls of their rum and wine was served out to the people, who begun to faint, and damaged bread wet through the bags, and most of them had little clothes but rags. They counted 30, crowded in a space which left scarce room for motion or exertion. They did their best to modify their case. One half sat up, though numbed with the immersion, while t'other half were laid down in their place, at watch and watch. Thus, shivering like the tertian ague in its cold fit, they filled their boat, with nothing but the sky for a greatcoat. 'Tis very certain the desire of life prolongs it. This is obvious to physicians, when patients, neither plagued with friends nor wife, survive through very desperate conditions, because they still can hope, nor shines the knife nor shears of Atropos before their visions. Despair of all recovery spoils longevity, and makes men's miseries of alarming brevity. 'Tis said that persons living on annuities are longer lived than others. God knows why, unless to plague the granters. Yet so true it is, that some, I really think, do never die. Of any creditor the worst a Jew it is, and that's their mode of furnishing supply. In my young days they lent me cash that way, which I found very troublesome to pay. 'Tis thus with people in an open boat. They live upon the love of life, and bear more than can be believed or even thought, and stand like rocks the tempests wear and tear. And hardship still has been the sailor's lot, since Noah's Ark went cruising here and there. She had a curious crew as well as cargo, like the first old Greek privateer, the Argo. But man is a carnivorous production, and must have meals, at least 1 meal a day. He cannot live like woodcocks upon suction, but like the shark and tiger must have prey. Although his anatomical construction bears vegetables in a grumbling way, your labouring people think beyond all question beef, veal and mutton better for digestion. And thus it was with this our hapless crew, for on the third day there came on a calm, and though at first their strength it might renew, and lying on their weariness like balm, lulled them like turtles sleeping on the blue of ocean, when they woke they felt a qualm, and fell all ravenously on their provision, instead of hoarding it with due precision. The consequence was easily foreseen. They ate up all they had, and drank their wine, in spite of all remonstrances, and then, on what in fact next day were they to dine? They hoped the wind would rise, these foolish men, and carry them to shore. These hopes were fine, but as they had but one oar, and that brittle, it would have been more wise to save their victual. The fourth day came, but not a breath of air, and ocean slumbered like an unweaned child. The fifth day, and their boat lay floating there. The sea and sky were blue and clear and mild. With their one oar, I wish they had had a pair, what could they do? And hunger's rage grew wild. So Juan's spaniel, spite of his entreating, was killed and portioned out for present eating. On the sixth day they fed upon his hide, and Juan, who had still refused, because the creature was his father's dog that died, now feeling all the vulture in his jaws, with some remorse received, though first denied, as a great favour one of the forepaws, which he divided with Pedrillo, who devoured it, longing for the other too. The seventh day, and no wind. The burning sun blistered and scorched, and, stagnant on the sea, they lay like carcasses, and hope was none, save in the breeze that came not. Savagely they glared upon each other. All was done, water and wine and food, and you might see the longings of the cannibal arise, although they spoke not, in their wolfish eyes. At length one whispered his companion, who whispered another, and thus it went round, and then into a hoarser murmur grew, an ominous and wild and desperate sound. And when his comrades thought each sufferer knew, 'twas but his own, suppressed till now, he found. And out they spoke of lots for flesh and blood, and who should die to be his fellow's food. But ere they came to this, they that day shared some 11 caps, and what remained of shoes. And then they looked around them and despaired, and none to be the sacrifice would choose. At length the lots were torn up and prepared, but of materials that much shock the muse. Having no paper, for the want of better, they took by force from Juan Julia's letter. The lots were made, and marked, and mixed, and handed in silent horror, and their distribution lulled even the savage hunger which demanded, like the Promethean vulture, this pollution. None in particular had sought or planned it. 'Twas nature gnawed them to this resolution, by which none were permitted to be neuter, and the lot fell on Juan's luckless tutor. He but requested to be bled to death. The surgeon had his instruments, and bled Pedrillo, and so gently ebbed his breath you hardly could perceive when he was dead. He died, as born, a Catholic in faith, like most in the belief in which they're bred, and first a little crucifix he kissed, and then held out his jugular and wrist. The surgeon, as there was no other fee, had his first choice of morsels for his pains, but being thirstiest at the moment, he preferred a draught from the fast-flowing veins. Part was divided, part thrown in the sea, and such things as the entrails and the brains regaled 2 sharks, who followed o'er the billow. The sailors ate the rest of poor Pedrillo. The sailors ate him, all save 3 or 4 who were not quite so fond of animal food. To these was added Juan, who, before refusing his own spaniel, hardly could feel now his appetite increased much more. 'Twas not to be expected that he should, even in extremity of their disaster, dine with them on his pastor and his master. 'Twas better that he did not, for in fact the consequence was awful in the extreme. For they who were most ravenous in the act went raging mad. Lord, how they did blaspheme, and foam and roll with strange convulsions racked, drinking salt water like a mountain stream, tearing and grinning, howling, screeching, swearing, and with hyena laughter died despairing. Their numbers were much thinned by this infliction, and all the rest were thin enough, heaven knows, and some of them had lost their recollection, happier than they who still perceived their woes, but others pondered on a new dissection, as if not warned sufficiently by those who had already perished, suffering madly for having used their appetites so sadly. And next they thought upon the master's mate, as fattest, but he saved himself because, besides being much averse from such a fate, there were some other reasons. The first was, he had been rather indisposed of late, and that which chiefly proved his saving clause was a small present made to him at Cadiz by general subscription of the ladies. Of poor Pedrillo something still remained, but was used sparingly. Some were afraid, and others still their appetites constrained, or but at times a little supper made. All except Juan, who throughout abstained, chewing a piece of bamboo and some lead. At length they caught 2 boobies and a noddy, and then they left off eating the dead body. And if Pedrillo's fate should shocking be, remember Ugolino condescends to eat the head of his arch-enemy the moment after he politely ends his tale. If foes be food in hell, at sea 'tis surely fair to dine upon our friends, when shipwreck's short allowance grows too scanty, without being much more horrible than Dante. And the same night there fell a shower of rain, for which their mouths gaped like the cracks of earth when dried to summer dust, till taught by pain men really know not what good water's worth. If you had been in Turkey or in Spain, or with a famished boat's crew had your berth, or in the desert heard the camel's bell, you'd wish yourself where truth is, in a well. It poured down torrents, but they were no richer until they found a ragged piece of sheet, which served them as a sort of spongy pitcher, and when they deemed its moisture was complete, they wrung it out. And though a thirsty ditcher might not have thought the scanty draught so sweet as a full pot of porter, to their thinking they ne'er till now had known the joys of drinking. And their baked lips with many a bloody crack sucked in the moisture, which like nectar streamed. Their throats were ovens, their swollen tongues were black, as the rich man's in hell, who vainly screamed to beg the beggar who could not rain back a drop of dew, when every drop had seemed to taste of heaven. If this be true indeed, some Christians have a comfortable creed. There were 2 fathers in this ghastly crew, and with them their 2 sons, of whom the one was more robust and hardy to the view. But he died early, and when he was gone, his nearest messmate told his sire, who threw one glance on him and said, "Heaven's will be done. I can do nothing." And he saw him thrown into the deep, without a tear or groan. The other father had a weaklier child, of a soft cheek and aspect delicate, but the boy bore up long, and with a mild and patient spirit held aloof his fate. Little he said, and now and then he smiled, as if to win a part from off the weight he saw increasing on his father's heart, with the deep, deadly thought that they must part. And o'er him bent his sire, and never raised his eyes from off his face, but wiped the foam from his pale lips, and ever on him gazed. And when the wished-for shower at length was come, and the boy's eyes, which the dull film half glazed, brightened, and for a moment seemed to roam, he squeezed from out a rag some drops of rain into his dying child's mouth. But in vain. The boy expired, the father held the clay, and looked upon it long, and when at last death left no doubt, and the dead burden lay stiff on his heart, and pulse and hope was past, he watched it wistfully, until away 'twas borne by the rude wave wherein 'twas cast. Then he himself sunk down all dumb and shivering, and gave no sign of life, save his limbs quivering. Now overhead a rainbow, bursting through the scattering clouds, shone spanning the dark sea, resting its bright base on the quivering blue, and all within its arch appeared to be clearer than that without, and its wide hue waxed broad and waving like a banner free, then changed like to a bow that's bent, and then forsook the dim eyes of these shipwrecked men. It changed, of course, a heavenly chameleon, the airy child of vapour and the sun, brought forth in purple, cradled in vermilion, baptized in molten gold, and swathed in dun, glittering like crescents or a Turk's pavilion, and blending every colour into one, just like a black eye in a recent scuffle. For sometimes we must box without the muffle. Our shipwrecked seamen thought it a good omen. It is as well to think so now and then. 'Twas an old custom of the Greek and Roman, and may become of great advantage when folks are discouraged, and most surely no men had greater need to nerve themselves again than these. And so this rainbow looked like hope, quite a celestial kaleidoscope. About this time a beautiful white bird, web-footed, not unlike a dove in size and plumage, probably it might have erred upon its course, passed oft before their eyes, and tried to perch, although it saw and heard the men within the boat, and in this guise it came and went, and fluttered round them till night fell. This seemed a better omen still. But in this case I also must remark, 'twas well this bird of promise did not perch, because the tackle of our shattered bark was not so safe for roosting as a church, and had it been the dove from Noah's Ark, returning there from her successful search, which in their way that moment chanced to fall, they would have ate her, olive branch and all. With twilight it again came on to blow, but not with violence. The stars shone out, the boat made way, yet now they were so low they knew not where nor what they were about. Some fancied they saw land, and some said no. The frequent fog-banks gave them cause to doubt. Some swore that they heard breakers, others guns, and all mistook about the latter once. As morning broke, the light wind died away, when he who had the watch sung out and swore, if 'twas not land that rose with the sun's ray, he wished that land he never might see more. And the rest rubbed their eyes and saw a bay, or thought they saw, and shaped their course for shore. For shore it was, and gradually grew distinct and high and palpable to view. And then of these some part burst into tears, and others, looking with a stupid stare, could not yet separate their hopes from fears, and seemed as if they had no further care, while a few prayed, the first time for some years, and at the bottom of the boat 3 were asleep. They shook them by the hand and head, and tried to awaken them, but found them dead. The day before, fast sleeping on the water, they found a turtle of the hawksbill kind, and by good fortune, gliding softly, caught her, which yielded a day's life, and to their mind proved even still a more nutritious matter because it left encouragement behind. They thought that in such perils more than chance had sent them this for their deliverance. The land appeared a high and rocky coast, and higher grew the mountains as they drew, set by a current toward it. They were lost in various conjectures, for none knew to what part of the earth they had been tossed, so changeable had been the winds that blew. Some thought it was Mount Etna, some the highlands of Candia, Cyprus, Rhodes, or other islands. Meantime the current, with a rising gale, still set them onwards to the welcome shore, like Charon's bark of spectres, dull and pale. Their living freight was now reduced to 4, and 3 dead, whom their strength could not avail to heave into the deep with those before, though the 2 sharks still followed them, and dashed the spray into their faces as they splashed. Famine, despair, cold, thirst, and heat had done their work on them by turns, and thinned them to such things a mother had not known her son amidst the skeletons of that gaunt crew. By night chilled, by day scorched, thus one by one they perished, until withered to these few, but chiefly by a species of self-slaughter, in washing down Pedrillo with salt water. As they drew nigh the land, which now was seen unequal in its aspect here and there, they felt the freshness of its growing green that waved in forest tops and smoothed the air and fell upon their glazed eyes like a screen from glistening waves and skies so hot and bare. Lovely seemed any object that should sweep away the vast, salt, dread, eternal deep. The shore looked wild, without a trace of man, and girt by formidable waves, but they were mad for land, and thus their course they ran, though right ahead the roaring breakers lay. A reef between them also now began to show its boiling surf and bounding spray, but finding no place for their landing better, they ran the boat for shore and overset her. But in his native stream, the Guadalquivir, Juan to lave his youthful limbs was wont, and having learnt to swim in that sweet river, had often turned the art to some account. A better swimmer you could scarce see ever. He could perhaps have passed the Hellespont, as once, a feat on which ourselves we prided, Leander, Mr. Ekenhead, and I did. So here, though faint, emaciated and stark, he buoyed his boyish limbs, and strove to ply with the quick wave, and gain, ere it was dark, the beach which lay before him, high and dry. The greatest danger here was from a shark, that carried off his neighbour by the thigh. As for the other 2, they could not swim, so nobody arrived on shore but him. Nor yet had he arrived but for the oar, which, providentially for him, was washed just as his feeble arms could strike no more, and the hard wave o'erwhelmed him as 'twas dashed within his grasp. He clung to it, and saw the waters beat, while he thereto was lashed. At last, with swimming, wading, scrambling, he rolled on the beach, half senseless, from the sea. There, breathless, with his digging nails he clung fast to the sand, lest the returning wave, from whose reluctant roar his life he wrung, should suck him back to her insatiate grave. And there he lay full length, where he was flung before the entrance of a cliff-worn cave, with just enough of life to feel its pain, and deem that it was saved, perhaps, in vain.